sent the confidential slide to YouTube, so. Are we live?
Yeah.
Cool. Hello, YouTube as well then. Okay, so let's see. We're on like slide 56 of 57 here. What's going on? Right, okay, that's in sync now. Okay, so Scott's pronunciation of the talk was, the title was correct. User platform. This is a phrase that people say a lot. The reason it's written like that is because it's said in terms of like, why do we have React? Why do we have Svelte? Why do we have Vue? Why are we making it so complicated? Why can't we just use PHP and render pages to people from the server? And it's all wonderful. It all works. Why are we making it complicated? And so what this is going into a few details in SvelteKit that bring us closer back to the platform, things that you may not have found in Sapper, because Sapper was, Sapper was great, but it didn't have that kind of close to the platform, close to the web feel that SvelteKit gives you. So it's just a brief overview, really, of like the things we've done, the decisions we've made to make it as native to just building something in JavaScript as possible. And Svelte itself is on the same philosophy. Like it's just JavaScript with a bit of reactivity. It's designed to look like JavaScript and act like JavaScript. And you'll find that a Svelte application, a Svelte page, stuck in a JavaScript, let's say a processor or in an IDE or something that understands the syntax, it won't show any errors. It's just JavaScript. Reactive statements are labels. Okay, so without further ado, is that too close? Is that better? Okay. Okay, so engineering APIs. As engineers, we love to make new things. We love to make things that look nice, that look cool, in terms of actually writing the API, writing the code itself, making something ergonomic. And sometimes we kind of go too far with this and we start doing things that move us further away from what it's actually written in, what it's actually supposed to look like, just for ergonomics and syntactic sugar. And so what I mean by this is we like to build something that we'll think other engineers will use and go, oh, that's so cool, it's so nice to use, and oh, it's wonderful. And it's satisfying when someone does that with your code and uses it and uses your APIs that you've invented. You go, wonderful, this is great. People are using my stuff and it's a nice feeling. But the problem is, building your own APIs is a learning curve. Building your own APIs means someone's got to go there and learn it and figure out how to use it. And all the knowledge they had before of how something else works is useless in that scenario. So, luckily, we're now in sort of modern age where the APIs that exist on the web that once upon a time were pretty rubbish. I mean, the data API is a good example of that. It's not very good to use. But now we have the temporal API, which I've not used it much, but I understand it's a much cleaner, much more easy to use, much more human language style data API. So I'm talking about APIs as in like JavaScript APIs, not as in REST, by the way. It's like interfaces to libraries and built-ins. Historically, browsers have had divergent APIs. So for example, Internet Explorer, which I'm sure you're all aware of, kind of had its own way of doing things. Edge, Edge Classic pulled that back a bit close to standards. And now we have Edge based on Chrome, which means that it's using the same stuff as Chrome. And Chrome's using WebKit. And WebKit is Conqueror, effectively, right? It's all gone back to essentially one rendering engine. And Firefox 2 is absolutely on the same line, a different rendering engine, but it keeps very close to the actual standards that are set out in ECMA script. And what that means is we have the APIs that work across all browsers, and there's no guesswork, and there's no mystery. They work well, and we can now leverage them. So frameworks nowadays should do that, rather than invent their own. And just an example of how, you've all heard of jQuery. Browser support's now there. If you look on, you might not need jQuery. That site will give you answers to everything you would have done to go cross-browser compatibility. It solved it for you, and now you can do it in just pure JavaScript. I think that's it on APIs. URL is another good example of a modern web API, and we'll go into why that's good later and how that works. So, the state of APIs. Like I said before, the demise of Internet Explorer and Edge Classic, the browser now consistent. We can go, hey, use the platform. The only outlier to this is potentially Safari, which is still lagging a little bit. Unfortunately, it's the default browser on iPhones, wherever my phone is. It's the one that's holding it all back still a little bit, but there's always one. There's always one. And caniuse.com, again, if you look at it now versus 10 years ago, look at 5 years ago, 2 years ago, 3 years ago, you'll find that all of these feature support matrices are all green. All modern browsers tend to support the same stuff. There's just one way of doing everything, which is great. Oh, and I should mention another Safari thing. I was looking at date pickers across browsers today, the native date picker, which you should be using because it's in everyone's browser, it's fast, it's usable. Safari has a bug where it doesn't load, and it's currently on its 13th year. Okay, so why native APIs? One, they're universal. So when I say universal, it's the one that's often misphrased, I've recently learned, as isomorphic. Isomorphic does not mean what people think it means. Universal is the correct language for that. It's basically the same on the client as on the server. They leverage existing knowledge. So if you've learned about, say, fetch or fetch or URL, let's say, it works everywhere. It works the same way. You learn it once and you can use it whatever you're doing. There's no bundling of these libraries because they're native. They're built to the browser. They're already there. Someone recently talked about bundling React into the browser, so let's hope that never happens. And they're fast because they're built in. There's no loading time. And there's less to write for us as maintainers. We don't have to write our own APIs. And there's fewer bugs because we all write bugs, let's face it. So, you're getting a lot for doing nothing effectively. So, SvelteKit. So svelte, the word svelte means kind of lean, slender, lightweight, fast. It also refers to the developer experience, not just, it refers to the user experience and the developer experience. We build fast, lightweight apps that work well, but also developers get that same great lightweight experience. Stuff works and it's fast. And SvelteKit, by virtue of being quite new, gets to use all of this stuff and leverage the fact that browsers now are quite good at doing what they've always done. Less to learn, less to write, and less to go wrong. So what does this result in? I'll go back to this one second. So it's a smaller surface area to learn. It's quicker to learn if you're not learning all these native things. You're not learning all these basics again. There's less documentation, there's less learning curve, and someone who's used something else that's quite good and quite native can come to your framework, pick up the little bits extra that it does, a little bit of syntactic sugar on top, but essentially keep using their knowledge. So the response object. The response object is one that I was initially a bit miffed that we removed it from SvelteKit because I quite liked the old style. So you can see here the kind of, it's from memory because we removed it quite quickly, but you used to apply that from an endpoint in SvelteKit. So you used to kind of build JSON object, which has here's my content type, here's my body, and you just render that, and you'd say it's this content type, render it as that, or you can send a redirect, you can send a status code, you can send all this kind of stuff. But now we use response. So response here is the web built in the native response. The documentation is there on Mozilla's site. Mozilla obviously nothing to do with Svelte, it's just a browser manufacturer. And you can get all the information you need for rendering anything you want dead easily just using the response object. So if I want to render JSON now, we've got a JSON helper which serializes it. But essentially you just pass it to the constructor response and it's done. I feel that was quite neat, but I'm now happy with response now. I know how to use it. And now I've learned it, I can just use it anywhere. Anywhere I want to use it, I can use it. You can pass in buffers, so you can render images. If you put your image data in a buffer and just pass that buffer to the constructor, you tell it what content type it is, and it will render your image to the browser. I was going to do a talk on that actually, because I find it quite useful for generating things using Node Canvas, so QR codes, for example, and just render them straight from SvelteKit endpoints. And the other thing that's nice about not having this kind of proprietary thing for doing responses is that it requires a lot of thought to design APIs. You'll notice that in Svelte, a lot of time is spent discussing APIs. So much discussion around how things are done. Stuff is an example of sometimes when the discussions go on forever and we never really reach a good conclusion and we end up calling something stuff. And I'm sure Rich will detail this in his talk as well, actually. But essentially, stuff was one of those things where we couldn't figure out a good name. it used to be called context, which is equally meaningless. But yeah, so good API design is hard. It takes time. It's time consuming. I'm sure we'd rather have better, cooler features than trying to redesign something that already exists. Yeah, essentially that's it. It's so simple. I've run out of words to describe it. URL. So this is probably one of my favorite and most used native built-ins. This is the URL object. It's been there since day dot, but I think the way it works, the ergonomics are really nice. You basically stick a URL in it, and if you were to go, well, let's assign that to a variable and then just console log that variable, it's broken up for you. It's got kind of the scheme, it's got the host, it's got the path name, and then it's got all the query parameters in a map for you. And it's kind of done that automatically just from that single call. And the constructor is kind of cool as well, because you can actually pass an instance of itself into it. So it's like Inception. What it will take really is anything that can have a toString and be serialized, it can use as a constructor argument. But the reason I find that quite useful is because I recently built a proxy, for example, and all I do is take the URL incoming from the SvelteKit request. I stick it in the URL, it's all broken up for me. I change the host and I pump it back out the other side and say redirect to there. And there's just zero effort. There's no string replacement. There's no fluffing around trying to figure out which bit's the host and has it got weird characters in the domain and are there enough slashes and all that kind of stuff. It's just change the host, .host equals blah, done. And I think the ergonomics of that are really nice. Yeah, and the other thing I guess is you don't need to worry about the kind of intrinsics of parsing query arguments. There's different ways to do it, but this will use what the browser uses, and that's really what's important for you. So URL search params. I talked about the query param parsing in the last slide. When you pass some query arguments, it builds a map for you, and in that map, you can just do set and get for any of the parameters and get the value and set the value. The super nice thing is sometimes someone's passed in the foo parameter. Have they passed it? Have they left it intentionally blank? Is it an empty string? You know, what have they actually done? And you can kind of try to like be defensive about that in code and check all the exception cases and stuff. But now you just say, well, is it in the map or is it not? And if it's not, done, easy. And I think that's just really nice. I think it's a really great API and one of my personal favorites. And fetch, of course, everyone will have seen fetch. Fetch is another one that's kind of, it's a tough one to quantify because I think that there was a lot of fetch libraries got an Axios 2 examples and people use them quite a lot. Axios especially because people said, oh, it's isomorphic, it works on server and client the same way. What it is a lot of bloat. It's a very large library. And actually the maintainers annoyed me because they wouldn't do built-in retrying. That annoyed me, so I fell out with them. But fetch, I mean, it's not the world's most glamorous API. I don't like stringifying things to stick it in the body, but you know what? It works. And it's there, and it's always there, and it's on the server, and it's in the client. And it's now on DC inside Node, which means it's now on DC inside SvelteKit. And then DC is a library created by Matteo Collina, I think that's how you pronounce his name, who is a very well-respected developer who also wrote Fastify. So now the Node fetch implementation is 100% compatible, but it's going to next level it, and we're going to have an even better fetch implementation when that moves to browsers too. So that's pretty exciting. But the most exciting thing of all is here. That's it. That's the most exciting thing. And if you want to do things such as like you might do with Axios, say, set a base host name, you've got an API and a URL with a version, and you want to prefix all your requests with that, you just write a wrap around it, 2-line wrap around it, done, and it'll still work the same way. Okay, that's the end of the talk. You can type these in AOL browser. I'm sure you've all got that. That's my Twitter and that's my GitHub. And I'm on Mastodon, but my name is really weird. So if anyone wants my Mastodon address, let me know. I'll tell you. Okay, thank you. Should we do questions, Scott? Nope. Nope, no questions.
No questions for Anthony. Awesome. I remember Anthony saying I haven't really done any slides. And he rocks up with. And yeah, that was really impressive. Thank you, Anthony. So now I've got to try and. How do we get out of full screen now? Right, whatever. Just do this one.
Probably that one, yeah. Edit. This is edit. Is it?
Was it not?
Doesn't matter.
Yay. Here we go. Right. Just use that button there. That works fine for me. Right. So I'm going to be talking about a project I worked on recently. And when I say recently, I know there's certain people in the chat who will be smirking at that. So it's a project for e-commerce, and it's on a really good platform. Not the platform which I work for. I work for Storyblock, but it's an e-commerce platform. I'm going to talk about the stack. So it uses Venture. We'll come on to Venture in a second. SvelteKit, KickQL, Houdini, Tailwind CSS, and Daisy UI. So there's a couple of them which need a bit of explanation, others which don't really need any explanation at all. So, but Venture, if you've not heard of it, it's a GraphQL-based e-commerce solution, which is also open source. And I was introduced to it back in the end of last year, start of this year maybe. And they've got a Swish website, and you can get started with it super quick. You know, the usual DX you have for a project. So I haven't checked out this site until I was actually putting these slides together. I was quite impressed by it, so I thought I'd add this on here. So free advertising for Venture, but super nice looking site there anyway. And the creator of Venture Commerce is a guy called Michael Bromley. And I'm just putting his Twitter up there because it's a way of me saying thanks. And also congratulations, because Venture Commerce was incorporated a couple of months ago, and he's now full-time working on that. And while I'm thanking people, there's also a guy called Jean-Yves Couet, who's been instrumental in helping me sort of get this to where it is at the moment. So you want to know anything about GraphQL with SvelteKit, Jean-Yves is your man. I strongly suggest you go check him out on Twitter. He's been building in public KickQL, and he's got a massive thread on everything he's been doing with that over the past, 12 months now, I guess. So anyway, let's talk about the stack. So SvelteKit, with the nice new logo, but I'm not going to talk about that just yet. So there's a bit of a story to how this all started and where it is now. So I'm just going to bore you with the slides before we actually get to looking at the product or the end result. But we'll talk about KickQL quickly. So KickQL uses SvelteKit, utilizes endpoints and stores, and KickQL is uses GraphQL via endpoints, and I just said stores, didn't I? But uses Svelte stores to store your queried information, so you can use it in your front end. And there's a technology called Houdini, which you can now use to query your GraphQL data on the client. So there was a time when it was just KickQL. We did both the client and the server-side stuff, but maybe it's September time, Jean-Yves and I think the guy's name's Alex Sarvez, got together because they're both doing GraphQL with SvelteKit and decided to mix the two together. But these three here make a great synergy. Mandatory David Brent GIF. Yeah. So it uses Daisy UI. Now, this is just, irrelevant to the actual, how it works, but I really like Daisy UI. Daisy UI is basically just a Tailwind CSS plugin. I'm not going to talk about Tailwind CSS, but Daisy UI removes a lot of the cruft you get with Tailwind. And the creator of Daisy UI, Puya, I think his name is, or Sidegi, he goes by those two names, made this meme on Twitter. He's very prolific in memes, but this is the best one for demonstrating Daisy UI to anyone who uses it. You're not locked into it. You can use Tailwind classes on top of it, but it does help with scaffolding stuff out quickly, which is basically what this project was, just to get something up and running in SvelteKit using Venture. So January 2022 was when I first started this project. So I was approached by Michael and I said, absolutely, I would love to do that and have a play about this and get cracking on it. So towards the end of January, knocked up a starter. A couple of days later, I was quite, happy with my progress. Doing this over the weekend, all came together quite quickly. And I thought this project was going to be start to finish and done, but I won't be here talking about it if it wasn't, if it was that simple. It was more like this. And if you don't get the good place reference, then sorry. I've already mentioned John Eves a couple of times already. He turned up in the Svelte London March meetup, gave a great presentation, and the YouTube slide is there. That's John Eves. He rocked up, blew everyone away with KitQL and what you could do with it. And, I was so impressed with using it. I was using it a couple of weeks before. I asked him to come on and be a speaker for us. I started implementing it straight away. You can get that link there from one of the previous Svelte Society London meetups, or just search Svelte London March 2022. Anyway, so back then, before I started using KitQL, I was using Venture, SvelteKit. I mean, the only difference is I was using GraphQL Request. And I soon started to run into limitations with, fetching stuff over the network and waiting for stuff to load. And Jean Yves, once he gave us this great demo, I was like, well, I've got to use this. So KitQL will, use your GraphQL queries, put them into a store for you, and you can access that data straight away. So super impressed with that. So around March, I decided to refactor the project. And it was in JavaScript before, and I moved it over to TypeScript as well. So that took a while, and in the midst of that, Svelte Summit happened. Everyone remember Svelte Summit? Enjoyed that? Yay! Remember this? Yeah, yay! Richard was really happy about it. Basically, for those who don't know, the routing structure for SvelteKit changed. So our underscore layout file was now plus layout, and index was no more. It was plus page. I don't actually have a comparison, but at the time I was using, still I'm using Renovate, and after that announcement, everything stopped working. So I just, I left it for a bit after that. This was, when was this? In the summer. I was transitioning between jobs, and it was a bit of a side project, so it just got left. And it was at Svelte Summit went actually met Jean-Yves in person and said, look, from all these changes which have happened, we just need to, get on and do a little stream, make a bit of content, which was, it was effectively Jean-Yves doing everything because I was sick as a dog and I was actually no use on the stream at all. But I'd made the social contract of tweeting out the day before that we'd be streaming it. And I was so sick the next day I could barely talk. But Jean-Yves, went through all the changes which had happened, which incorporated the breaking changes in SvelteKit and also using Houdini as well, and all of the new changes which happened with that. So another link. I'll share the slides afterwards. You don't need to, try and do. I mean, you probably don't want to. It's a long stream, 90 minutes. So, how long have I been talking for? Right. So the slides I've done, and I've just worked out. I've got to use my laptop. An older microphone. So let's see how this goes. Right, do you want to grab that? There's a lapel mic here. Let's just try this. Do you want to just talk for a second?
What am I going to talk about, Scott? I'm not a stand-up comedian. Sorry?
You haven't what?
Joke.
Joke.
How many jokes?
What's orange and sounds like a parrot? Oh, God.
It's quite good. That's not really a joke, it's a question.
It's a dad joke.
With an answer. It is
It's
a dad joke.
absolute dad joke. Right.
Yeah.
Absolute dad joke. It's pretty much just really.
You know the guy who emceed the summit in Sweden. He used to be a stand-up comedian. He's Tejas Kumar. He's got a massive advantage for this kind of thing.
Yeah. Okay, so can everyone hear me now? So I've got hands free. Do you want to take that with you so there's no feedback? Or turn it off. Thank you. Right, so I'll turn the camera off because I'm going to be hunching like this. While I try and actually work out winner. Oh my God. Live coding, yay, woo! Right, so let's, how do I escape? Right, okay, cool. Do I have localhost up here? Nope. Right, start up their server. So what I should have actually shown you as well is my terminal. So Houdini will go off and generate all your queries at the start of the project running. It'll go off and use the configuration, hit the endpoint, and make all of the queries which are in the project. It will type them and make the data available to you from there. But I'm going to, because Microsoft Edge isn't my default browser, but I'm using Microsoft Edge because, Microsoft Reactor. Let's just go check this out. Right, so here's the project. So this is just the standard default. You look at the Angular one, the React one, and I'm not sure what other examples there are. I think there's a Gatsby one. They're always basically the exact same assets and same layout. So I had something to follow along with. And we just grouped into categories here and then subcategories along the top. What I need to fix, which doesn't work at the moment, is the filter here. So we can filter out stuff. This is all done via reactive statements. We could take a look at the code in a second. So I'll say thank you to Puya as well. Both him and I sat down trying to work out how to make this all reactive and sort of did all right. I mean, it's a bit janky, but I need to work on that. So this, at the moment, we've got a car here. We've got some optimistic UI updates here. We can close this. We can go off and get our 32-inch monitor, add it to our basket, and it updates. And that's great. So that's pretty much the application, really. We've got navigation here, but this is all just powered off of one massive query from Avenger. So if I go off and get the code from VS Code, probably it's just going to turn up. Next screen. Ooh. Right. Man, this is going to be hard for me to explain this while I'm sort of craning around to try and work out what's going on. Right, let's just take a quick tour of the project, and I'm literally going to have to stand back here and look at what's here. Yeah, total professional. Right, let's bump up this font size a bit. What's that? Thank you. So, what that GraphQL language feature is. So let's read every file in the project. No, that's not. There's a byte config for Houdini, which is needed. So Houdini where's the package.json file? We have a prepare script, so we'll run that generate, which we looked at when I started up the project. It'll go off and generate all the queries for you. The queries are in the lib folder here, and we've got GraphQL. And we've just got two here. So get collections, which is basically all of the data in there on the extension. I can help with GQL files. Oh, I don't have the GraphQL code extension on. Slightly embarrassing. Yeah, let's do that. Right. Totally lost my train of thought now. Yep. So while that's installing, let's go over to Explorer here. So let's get collections. Hey, syntax highlighting, brilliant. So this is off of the read-only Avenger endpoint, which we could find in the Houdini config here. So this at the moment is just hard-coded in here. Obviously, if you're going to be using Avenger, you're going to have it running on your own server as a service somewhere. This is super handy just for running examples from. And this is also pointing to the client, which is defined here. So we're bringing in our endpoint, and then we're doing some stuff here for the authorization. Ignore that. It's just an example project. Yeah, we set up our client, and we've got a Houdini client here, which we can start using in our pages, which is in our routes here. So we've got a page felt, and then we're using this GQL get collections here. So this is generated by Houdini, and once we know there's a browser running, we're going to fetch the information for that, and then we can do what we want with it. So on the main page here, I think I'm using these collections just to pass into the category banner, and then also for the nav information, and just to populate things like that. You notice here I've got this page.gql. So it's following the SvelteKit convention, but this is just to go off, and Houdini uses this to get top sellers information, and I think that is on, where is that? It's in the layer here. Yeah, get top sellers. So in our layout file, we're using Houdini to go off and get information for the top sellers. We're using a layout query here, which is, I believe, information for the navigation items. I'm also getting the top sellers. So following this convention for the SvelteKit, plus layout, it's really handy if we just want to make a query. This layout GQL is going to come into here as the page data. And then we're using this little trick here. I'm not sure if everyone's aware of this, but you put this in parenthesis, and then you can destructure out your information from there. Super useful. And that's pretty much it. I mean, I've got some basic stores in here. These are really simple, just for cart state, the local currency code, I think it is, and the filters, which needs a lot of work, as I demonstrated earlier. And that's it, really. So if anyone has any information, any questions, ask, and I'll try and answer. But I'm guessing everyone's waiting for Rich, really. So. No questions? Let's stick online. Oh, Michael's watching. Awesome. Michael Bromley. Thank you, Michael. So we've got no questions. So I'm trying to use StreamYard, and I've just noticed my pointer's over here. So how are we going to do this without getting some streamception going on? Anthony. So we've got Rich. Let's go turn it off. Oh, it's off. Right, I don't know how we're going to show Rich on here. So, what do you reckon? Make this big, and then move this over here. That didn't work.
Don't you have to stop showing that?
Yeah?
That's it. Put that on there.
I guess it's just me now. I've got no idea if anyone can see and or hear me, so I'm just going to sit here twiddling my thumbs for a minute.
Yep.
Cool.
We can both hear and see you, but you couldn't hear us, Rich, so sorry.
Hey, all right. I've shared my screen as well. Can you see that?
Yep. I'll go to that now.
All right. Very excited to be at my first ever Svelte London meetup. Even if it's like this. One day I will make it there in person. In fact, I'm going to be in London next week. I'm heading back home for the holidays, but I'm not there now. So this will have to do. I think that if you're at a Svelte meetup, you probably know that SvelteKit was launched last week. It's been talked about already by Scott and Anthony. If you're not aware somehow, it is the officially recommended way to build Svelte applications. And if you want to learn about it, go to kit.svelte.dev. But I'm not going to demo it in this talk or really talk about it because it's been well covered. So the reaction has been way better than I dared hope. Fireship called it a genre-defining masterpiece, which is pretty nice as testimonials go. When you're working on something like this in a cave for a long period of time, it's really hard to know if people outside will care about the thing that you're building, because all you can see is the flaws and limitations, and you're very aware that outside the thing that you're working on, especially in web development, there are so many other great options that like maybe we'll launch it and no one will care. So Wednesday was an incredibly gratifying day for us. It was really very enjoyable. Even on Hacker News, which is famously a place where developers compete for the title of grumpiest bastard, people only really said nice things about SvelteKit, which is unheard of for a new JavaScript framework. So this is kind of the point at which we should probably just take some time off and bask in the good feelings of having shipped something that we're proud of. But rather than sit here and talk about all the things that we did right, I think it's more constructive and probably more interesting to do a bit of a retrospective on all of the things that we got wrong. So I'm going to talk about 10 mistakes that we made while we were building SvelteKit, starting with TypeScript. When we started working on the SvelteKit code base, TypeScript was an obvious choice. The whole team knows TypeScript. We all really love TypeScript. When you're building a largish system like an application framework, type safety is really important. Not just for the people consuming your APIs, but for you as you're working in the code base. And so given that Svelte was already written in TypeScript, it just kind of made sense for us to do that. But it turns out that it is a massive drag on productivity when you use TypeScript when you're still in a kind of exploratory phase. And right back at the start, we were still trying to figure out elementary things like how to divide functionality between the different packages. And I was trying to use SvelteKit to build the New York Times' COVID tracker at the time. And so that drag on velocity was absolutely crippling. So we should have just not worried about type safety until later in the project. And this PR from November 2020 was me just finally reaching the end of my tether. And you can see that the branch in which I removed TypeScript from the code base was called Liberation, because that's how I felt. So our first big mistake was using TypeScript. Our second big mistake was not using TypeScript. Like I said, we are strong believers in this stuff. And particularly when you're building anything complex, type safety is an absolute must. When you're in the exploratory phase, TypeScript is a drag on velocity. But when you're no longer in the exploratory phase, then not having types is an even bigger drag on velocity. And with hindsight, we waited a little bit too long to tighten things up. So when we did introduce types, we did so in a slightly unconventional manner. Instead of using TypeScript with .ts files, all of our type annotations live in js.comments in .js files. So this means we get all of the benefits of TypeScript. We get the type checking and the auto completion, easy refactoring, all of that, but nothing needs to be compiled. It's all just vanilla JavaScript. There are some concrete downsides to using JS.doc annotations. The annotations are more verbose. You can't do things like declare generic interfaces. So you need a separate DTS file for some stuff. You can't use certain features like the new satisfies operator, which shipped in TypeScript 4.9, which is super helpful. But on balance, I can't recommend this setup enough. It removes so many headaches, and it's how I'm going to build everything in future. The third mistake that we made was kind of related to the first. For the longest time, SvelteKit was bundled. What I mean by that is that we would have a pre-published step where we took the source code and we turned it into a dist folder of JavaScript files that inlined all of our dependencies. And so that is what you would install from NPM. And in theory, this approach to releasing packages has some really nice benefits. Your dependency tree is shallower, so your installation is faster, and startup in theory is a little bit faster, and it takes less space on disk. And if you're using TypeScript, then you have to have a compile step anyway, so you may as well build an optimized production version at the same time. But it has some real downsides too. Anyone who has ever tried to debug bundled code will know that source maps just don't work a lot of the time. And I definitely experienced that a bunch. Like, you have to try and figure out which piece of source code is responsible for the error that you're seeing because you don't get a high fidelity stack trace that you can trust. And it also adds a bunch of overhead. Like, you have to rebuild the framework every time you want to run the tests. And sometimes you forget to do that. And then you're left wondering why the test isn't passing, even though you just fixed the thing. And so that just keeps kind of piling up and becomes very annoying. And so for a long time, we had this hybrid approach where we would ship an optimized production build of the framework, but we would run source code locally when we were running the tests, except in CI, where obviously we had to test the production build. But then we had some discrepancies between the behavior of the production build and the behavior of the unbundled source code. And it just became extremely complicated. So we stopped doing that. The fact is that now at the end of 2022, everyone is running a version of Node that can handle native JavaScript modules out of the box. And so there's basically no reason to bundle anything until you serve it to users. So if you're creating a library or a framework and publishing it to NPM, just ship source code. It's all you need to do. It's so much easier now than it ever used to be. Okay, the fourth mistake we made was not trusting Vite enough to fully commit to it. Those of you who've followed SvelteKit's development for a long time will know that at the beginning we used a thing called Snowpack, which similar concept to Vite. And eventually we were forced to conclude that Snowpack wasn't really working out for us. And so 2 weeks after Vite 2 came out, we switched over to it, and we were basically the first people to do so. It's weird to say this now that Vite has kind of conquered the industry, but at the time this was a risky move. And so we hedged our bets. We didn't go all in. What I mean by that is SvelteKit remained in control of everything. We had our own CLI with our own dev and build commands, and they would call Vite as a library effectively. So Vite was a dependency of SvelteKit. And the idea was that if things didn't work out for whatever reason, we could just swap Vite out for whatever replaced it, and provide the same experience to SvelteKit users. So if you needed to configure Vite, you would do it in your svelte.config.js instead of in a vite.config.js and stuff like that. And there's a few other SSR frameworks out there that use Vite, such as Astro, and they made the same choice that we did for whatever reason. If you create an Astro project, then you run Astro Dev instead of running Vite Dev, and it opens on port 3000 instead of Vite's native 5173. But what we found is that tucking Vite away behind the scenes like that makes it harder to fully participate in the Vite ecosystem. And it means we end up doing a lot of work that Vite could be doing for us. So a few months ago in this PR, we switched things around, and now SvelteKit is actually just a Vite plugin. And that's the way that it should have been all along. Paradoxically,
Rich, sorry
Wait,
to disturb you. You've got a VS Code dialogue shown on the screen, and
oh no,
it's
go
giving
away.
a lot of people anxiety. So yeah, hey, thank you.
Okay, sorry about that. Okay, so the paradox is that by fully embracing Vite and turning ourselves into a Vite plugin, we're actually now much better able to consider other build tools as well. A couple of months ago, Vercel, where I work, we announced a new Rust-powered build tool called TurboPack, which in many respects is the complete opposite of Vite. A large part of Vite's role is to sort of curate the best parts of the existing tooling ecosystem and make it play really nicely together. And that's been a really successful strategy. TurboPack is doing the reverse. It's kind of building all of the constituent parts so that they all fit together by design. And through a combination of Rust magic and caching magic, it can, in theory, build apps way faster. We haven't been able to put this to the test yet, because TurboPack is still in its very early stages. But I can imagine a future in which you can choose whether you want to use Vite or you want to use TurboPack based on your preferences. Okay, speaking of not trusting things, we didn't trust that we would be able to use native web APIs for request and response handling, and that was a mistake. Anthony's talked about this already, so I don't really need to introduce this concept, but for a long time, we were using our own APIs for this stuff, and we had a good reason for doing so. The main reason that we did that was that we had to use Node Fetch on Node, and Node Fetch isn't very spec compliant. Like, that's the only way that you could get the fetch and the request and response and headers, all of that stuff, was to use Node Fetch, but it had some glaring differences with the browser native fetch, particularly around how it implemented streaming interfaces and stuff. So we used all of that as an excuse to create our own interfaces, which felt more convenient, like you would get body parsing for free and all of that sort of thing. And requests and responses were just plain JavaScript objects. And for a long time, it worked pretty well. But there is, as Anthony talked about, there's a real cost to going it alone with these sorts of things. It's more stuff for people to learn. You have to reinvent a lot of functionality. We ran into some really tricky edge cases. The streaming that I mentioned, our design was never going to support streaming. And that was kind of okay for a long time because, Lambda doesn't support streaming, for example. But we could plainly see that the wins were not in our favor. And so luckily, by the time we had this realization, the Node team had released the polyfill that Anthony talked about called Undici. It's an Italian word that means 11. And in Node 18, Undici is automatically installed. So you get fetch and request and response and all of that stuff for free inside Node 18. So we used Undici in Node environments. And because we were early adopters stress testing it, we actually helped to identify a number of bugs that are now fixed. So Node 18 is actually more reliable directly because of SvelteKit, which I think is pretty cool. And there's just so many advantages to using these web APIs. From an implementation perspective, it makes our code simpler. From an integration perspective, it makes it easier for things like third-party auth libraries to work with our request response lifecycle. From an educational perspective, it always feels really good to be able to send people to an MDN page instead of to our own docs. And so with hindsight, we should have just been bolder and trusted the trajectory of the platform rather than worrying about short-term incompatibilities. All right, this next one is a little bit more nebulous, but an experience that I've had a bunch of times when working on SvelteKit and more generally in open source is that there'll be some nagging doubt about an API or design decision that either from a voice in my own head or from someone in an issue thread, and I'm psychologically incapable of attending to it because like, I just know that if I pull on that thread, the whole thing is going to unravel, and like I just don't have the bandwidth to deal with it. And when this happens, I call it a splinter. Like it's there, it causes some minor discomfort, but it doesn't actually stop anything from working. And a good example of this is the way that we initially designed the load function. There's a bunch of things that are weird about the iteration of load that you can see on screen. The fact that it's in script context equals module, which is just kind of ugly. The fact that it returns an object with a bunch of different properties, many of which are mutually exclusive. The fact that the design meant that layout and page load functions had to run serially instead of concurrently. Jonathan, you can see the highlighted text there. He pointed that out immediately, and I really should have paid attention to that and gone back to the drawing board. But we'd invested so much time and energy in getting to that place that I just kind of glossed over it. And then later we renamed the load function's context argument and return property to stuff because context was confusing. And if you ever find yourself calling something stuff in a public API, it's a pretty clear red flag and a sign that you need to go back and start again. So there were lots of splinters, but it felt good enough that we ignored them for months until they went gangrenous and we had to operate. And that's when this happened. Sorry, Scott. I know this was massively disruptive. And like, honestly, I go back and forth on whether we could have avoided some of that disruption by being smarter from the get-go, or if actually we needed to experience the pain of the prior design before we could feel our way to the new one. I honestly don't know, but my takeaway from this is that like I want to be more conscious of these splinters. I want to not ignore them. And I especially want to pay closer attention to feedback like what we got from Jonathan in that issue. Another thing that we've struggled with a little bit is naming stuff. We'll often have very long discussions among the maintainers about how to name certain things, and they become even longer discussions with the community. And sometimes the discussions get quite animated, and someone is always left feeling like we picked the wrong thing. I got this feedback via DM that we should have some design guidelines to help us make these decisions. Things like a function should always be a verb. A function name should always be a verb. And in general, I think that our APIs do make sense, but we could probably save ourselves a lot of time and avoid some inconsistencies if we had a better framework for evaluating different options. So that's something that we're going to be thinking about for next year. This one might seem surprising if you ever looked at the SvelteKit code base, because we have hundreds and hundreds of tests, both unit tests and end-to-end tests that run in Playwright. Like we are very much sold on the value of testing. But unfortunately, some parts of the code base aren't really written in a way that makes it easy to unit test them. And that is entirely my fault. I tend to overuse closures and stuff like that because I'm always trying to golf things down to the minimum size. But sometimes it's more important to expose the relevant parts so that you can actually unit test them effectively. And so as a result of this, we rely far more on end-to-end tests than we do on unit tests. And that's a problem because end-to-end tests are way more expensive than unit tests. And you have to test things in a very indirect way. And the result is stuff like you see here, I don't know. It frequently takes 25 minutes to run our test suite. And you often have to run them several times because they're flaky as hell. So this is something that we badly need to fix. Another thing that we need to fix is that we kind of gloss over platform differences a bit. For example, it's very easy to use Node built-in modules when you're developing locally. But when you deploy your app as, say, an edge function, you no longer have access to the file system. And so things fall apart and you get an error in production. On the flip side, APIs that do exist on the deployment target, like if you deploy to Deno, then you have access to a bunch of globals that you do not have when you're developing locally in Node. And to some extent, this is by design, since SvelteKit strives to be a platform agnostic framework so that you can move easily from one provider to another. And that is intentional, but it's also a problem that you can't use the unique capabilities of each platform. And so I kind of wish we'd paid slightly close attention to this earlier on. And this is one of our big post 1.0 to-dos. And then finally, I just have to own this one. My time estimations are absolute garbage. and not by like a factor of 2 or 3x, like a full order of magnitude garbage. I would like to say it's because I'm an eternal optimist. It's more likely because I'm an eternal moron. I'm just really bad at this stuff. I can't believe I made this statement a year before I even joined Vercel, when I was still doing this in my free time. I promise I'm trying to get better at it, but the takeaway is that you just shouldn't trust me when I give time estimations. Anyway, 2 years of getting things wrong in public, and here we are. I'm obscenely proud of the entire SvelteKit team. Really excited for people to build stuff with SvelteKit now that it's stable. If there's one thing that I hope people take away from this talk, it's that we are extremely fallible, but we are aware of our fallibility, and we don't let it stop us from shipping stuff, and nor should you. And that's it. Merry Christmas, everyone.
Yay. Thank you so much, Rich, for that. So I've asked in the chat if anyone's got any questions. Are you okay to hang about for a Q&A?
Sure, yeah.
First, I'd just like to say that I was very happy with the changes that happened. It gave me a lot of experience in refactoring projects, because I had quite a few. So I thought it was a good move, and I think everyone else agrees with that. But I have one question, is I didn't fully follow all of the discussion, but was there anything particularly spicy in there you'd like to talk about, or you just want to gloss over it and move on to the next question?
You mean with the changes to load and the routing specifically?
Yes.
I mean, the one thing that people kept coming back to is the fact that you now have a bunch of files with the same name in your project. And if you haven't set up your editor so that you see the directory name in the tab, then you could have in your editor, you know, you got your code here, and then you just got plus page, plus page, plus page, plus page, plus page, all across the top. And that is a nuisance, I will grant you. But it's the one trade-off that I think we were forced to make, because you get so many benefits in exchange for that. I like to frame it as a VS Code problem as opposed to a SvelteKit problem, because you had this before with index.js files anyway, and honestly, you can only really be working in one page at a time anyway, so you should probably just close all the other tabs. So I'm sympathetic to it being annoying, but not enough that we should have changed the decision.
It's just a text editor management thing, really, at the end of the day. And if you're like someone like the Primeagen, you don't use text editors anyway, so you just use the terminal. I call that stream.
Wrestling great with his hands.
And seeing him turn live was excellent. So great job on that. We're going to take some questions. If anyone's got any questions here. Yeah, I'm just going to go check the chat.
I'm going to look that way because the camera's up there, but Rich's face is there, and it's really confusing. But Scott's very good at it. So actually, I have one question for you, Rich, because I know we discussed it briefly, but I was not kind of really present at the time. But I found it weird the other day when I was playing with SvelteKit, and I had to throw a redirect, and it felt like one of those threads you were talking about. I know there's a reason behind it, but is it something contentious? Is it something that is just me thinks that's odd, or is that a kind of a general feeling amongst people who use it, maintainers, everyone else?
It's definitely not just you, but I think it is intentional, and like we can justify the decision, because essentially when you throw an error, what you're saying is that execution should stop. Like we are no longer interested in completing the work that we were currently doing. And that's true if like something fatal happened and you just need to return a 500 response. But it's also true if you want to redirect. And so if you have a function that is, for example, detecting whether someone is logged in, and if not, throws a redirect, then you actually want that execution to stop. You don't want to have to like run that logic and then decide what to do with the answer that you get. Like you just want to be able to verify that the user is logged in and then have that throw to a different place. Like they're kind of semantically the same thing. Errors and redirects, they're both things that should abort the current flow of execution.
Okay. Yeah, it's reasonable. Reasonable. Oh. I18N, please. That's the whole question.
Yeah.
I mean, you can derive from that what you want, but that's the question. I18, please, :DD,
Yeah,
which is a smiley.
So this is actually one of the oldest issues on the SvelteKit repo, is some sort of built-in internationalization primitives. And the reason that we haven't dealt with it yet is because it's just such a huge topic that we haven't even really figured out what it means to support I18N. So there's a few different things. It's like the request comes in, you need to figure out which locale is the appropriate locale for the request. And that could come from accept headers, it could come from the path name, it could come from a cookie. There's like a few different ways that you could do that. And then you've got to figure out based on that how to respond. Your routing could be internationalized. Like maybe you have a contact page written with a C in English, but it's written with a K in German. And you need a way to express that in your file system-based routing system, ideally in a way that doesn't involve param matches, because that's a really roundabout way to achieve that. You want to have some more idiomatic way of doing that. You want to be able to load translations based on the current locale. And at the moment, we don't have a good built-in way of doing that. All of these things are things that you can solve. And there are indeed user-land solutions for doing so, but it's a finicky enough thing that I think the framework providing some of this stuff out of the box would make everyone's lives much easier. And so now that 1.0 is done, this is very high on the priority list for us to figure out what is in scope there and what do we need to do to make it happen. I am pleased that one thing that we managed to get into 1.0 was optional root params, because this is a very common way of determining the locale. You'll have a lang parameter at the beginning of the path name. So / might be your default locale, / -de is your, like, that switches you into to German, and /fr switches you into French. And that was really awkward to do before we had optional root parameters. But the rest of it is still something that we've got to do. But yes, it is a very high priority. Yes.
And I think it gets even more complicated, because I remember learning about at university, you have internationalization and you have globalization, I think it is. So one refers to maybe making your application be able to cope with the fact that certain cultures don't have certain pages, for example. And that gets even more difficult with, with file-based routing. So that'll be a fun discussion. Can you see these questions on here, Rich? Or shall I read them?
I can, but there's a camera between me and the screen, so
I can read this one.
Way.
Yeah, could SvelteKit provide a built-in way
virtual list? I'm not sure what that would mean exactly. Svelte allows you to create virtual list components. I've written one myself. I'm sure there are better ones out there, but it's just like any other component that you can use. If the question is, like, is there some cheat code for doing infinite scroll in terms of the data loading aspect, then I think you could probably just do that with a server.js API route. I'm not sure that this is the kind of thing that SvelteKit needs to own, because it's something that you can already do in userland.
We had actually an interesting discussion today about what can we call, like, maybe deferred loading. So essentially things that you can load when the page is already on your screen and it's there, that doesn't involve going to fetch and then fetching data and bringing it back, but like calling some function that loads the data for you without all the bump in between. And maybe that would be good for virtual lists. I think the other thing is probably virtual lists could be implemented as an action. Maybe an action could help with that. So it wouldn't be built in probably, but it might be something that's community provided and quite well supported. Does SvelteKit have plans of providing some out-of-the-box WebSocket support?
Plans, no. Ambitions, yes. Definitely want to be able to have some way of dealing with WebSockets. You can obviously do this if you're building your own node server, but it would be nice to have something that would translate to other platforms. Dino has this broadcast channel API. I believe Cloudflare Workers either have something or are developing something kind of similar. It'd be really great to have some sort of framework primitive that mapped to these platform primitives so that you could do this in a framework agnostic way, the same way that you can with regular request response handlers. I don't know what that looks like. And maybe it's not that, maybe it's just providing more flexibility to access the underlying platform. We haven't quite figured that out yet, but absolutely, we want to have a good real-time story. At the moment, you have to sort of cobble together a lot of things yourself, which isn't ideal.
I think it's difficult as well because I think when SvelteKit was first conceived, there wasn't really Lambda support for WebSockets. I certainly struggled to find it myself.
I mean, it's still true today. Like it's just hard to use serverless to do real-time stuff. It's a fundamental mismatch.
Okay, cool. So we've got some questions from the audience here. We can't really do anything with the cameras. We've got an awesome turnout though. So thanks everyone for turning up. So we've got one question here.
Just two of them. First of all, congrats for releasing again, amazing stuff. I wanted to ask, you mentioned about how, you found these splinters and a lot of things kind of were discussed and adjusted throughout the process. What was that process like kind of with you and all the maintainers and kind of the online correspondence? How did you find something that didn't work and then make it better? What was that process like?
It varies from case to case, but a fairly typical thing will be we'll be talking amongst ourselves in the maintainers chat in the Discord, and someone will mention that this issue has come up once or twice, or it's been mentioned elsewhere in Discord once or twice, and it's starting to annoy people. And we'll start just back and forthing among ourselves about what a potential solution might be. And then sometimes someone, me or someone else, will go away and spend a bit of time thinking about what a solution to that problem might look like. And typically that will result in a gist that we just share amongst ourselves, and it'll have some API proposals, maybe some implementation details, kind of like an RFC, but much more informal because we're not presenting it to the public at this stage. And we'll talk about that amongst ourselves. And sometimes that can be like a very energetic discussion that will last for hours. Sometimes the solution is obvious enough that we agree that we should just present it to the community straight away. But sometimes we really have to spend some time nailing down a lot of the details, particularly for the bigger proposals like the routing changes. We talked about that amongst ourselves for a long time and changed a lot as a result of that process before we felt happy putting it on the discussion board and saying to the wider community, this is an idea, we'd love to know what you think. And that is not the end of the process. Like it's not like we discuss it ourselves and then we present it to the community as a fait accompli. It's very often the case that like until several hundred people have managed to have a look at it, and some people have experienced something that makes them realize that something is not going to work in the proposal, that we then go back and have to reconsider it all over again. And that in fact happened with the directory-based routing changes several times. And it's through a process of just responding to the feedback that we get and kind of shaping it over time that we eventually arrive at something that we're happy with, that the community is broadly happy with, and then it moves on to the PR stage. And then there's often some more feedback because we'll realize that the implementation that we designed in our collective ivory tower actually doesn't work. There's some technical constraint that means it's impossible, or along the way we'll discover a better way to do things. And so it's just this constant process of refinement and making the decision more and more public until we finally merge it and write documentation. But then other times something is so obvious that we'll just go straight from issue to pull request and it takes half a day. So it's always different, but we try and do this stuff in the open as much as is possible, but we want to not present stupid ideas to the community, and so we'll try and refine it amongst ourselves first.
Cool. Any other questions?
Hello, Rich. Congrats on release again and the rest of the team. So I wanted to ask, you mentioned earlier that you're thinking of adding TurboPack support. So does that mean that there will be more integrations with Vercel, or I guess how does your role at Vercel influence SvelteKit's future, really?
It's a good question. The way that it kind of works is that I am almost like a privileged outsider. I'm a person who, and the same is true of Simon because he works full time on Svelte at Vercel with me. We get to see what the company is working on by talking to like the Next team and the Edge Functions team and other teams. Like we find out what the company is building, and we get to road test some of those ideas, and we provide feedback that often shapes what those things end up looking like. So a good example of this would be the build output API, which is a thing that Vercel has, which allows any framework to use Vercel's primitives. It's image optimization, it's serverless functions, it's incremental static regeneration. Like all of these things are accessible through a thing called the build output API. And when I joined Vercel, we were in the process of designing the build output API. And as the privileged outsider, I came and had a look, and I was like, this is absolutely not going to work for SvelteKit for the following reasons. And so they kind of treat us as a very heavily invested focus group where they can test out these things and get feedback from like essentially external framework authors without having to consult external framework authors. And so that is, I think that perhaps signifies the relationship between Svelte and Vercel pretty well. There hasn't been any kind of suggestion that Svelte needs to have Vercel specific features or SvelteKit needs to have Vercel specific features. It's more that SvelteKit being in the fold means that Vercel is able to do a more comprehensive job of designing things that will work in a like open source and framework agnostic way.
I think it's also worth saying here, because I can see why people would say, oh, maybe Vercel's driving the direction of SvelteKit. Some of the maintainers are so against that there's no way that would ever happen. And I think the TurboPack's an interesting one because we put TurboPack on the Svelte organization, and I can't remember the exact figures. Maybe you can, Rich, but it went from like 20 minutes to 20 seconds to build or something. It was so fast. I think there's a thing here that a lot of the stuff that Vercel do is just really, really good. And then they're doing everything. They're just amazing. So yeah.
Yeah, but it's not just the maintainers who don't work at Vercel that are against that level of integration. The same is true for me and Simon. I think Vercel is a terrific company. I think it makes some terrific products, but I do not want Svelte to be a Vercel project, and it never will be a Vercel project. There's a healthy separation and independence, and the two things, the two sides are mutually beneficial, and that's how it should be.
Cool. So our product is built with Routify. Is it Routify or Routify? I don't know. Routify. Let's say Routify. And as excited I am about Kit, I'm not much looking forward to rebuilding it. How long do you think it's reasonable to put that off? A minute? 2 minutes?
You'd have to ask the Routify people, I guess. I'm not sure what the current state of that project is. I know there was some suggestion that SvelteKit had essentially fixed the things that were wrong with Sapper that caused Routify to need to be built in the first place. It's like Routify was essentially filling a gap that we had not filled, and now that we've filled it, I don't know how much of an appetite there is to continue working on that project. But I don't want to speak out of turn because it's not my project. Yeah, ask them.
Yeah, so I think that what Rich said is exactly spot on. I think I wouldn't move it until I found the need to move it, because it probably works fine. But yeah, I think that's a reasonable answer. Don't move it, do move it. Any thoughts on adding something similar to Rails and something similar to Rails engines to SvelteKit, i.e. the ability to create a modular SvelteKit app out of smaller SvelteKit apps?
Yeah, I think that's a reasonable feature request. In fact, I believe there is an issue on the tracker for something very much like that. And, SvelteKit was its first deployment was at the New York Times, where we have this COVID tracker that's built using SvelteKit, but we also have these embeds which appear on the front page, like a little bar giving you a snapshot of COVID data. And that is an embed that is built from a SvelteKit app, but is deployed in a completely separate context. So like from the beginning, we've had this concept of using SvelteKit to build things that are not SvelteKit apps. And I think this is kind of a natural extension of that, being able to compose SvelteKit apps together and treat them as these modular units. There are some technical challenges with that. Like at the moment, everything is a bit of a singleton because, we're listening for click events on links so that we can activate the client-side router. If you have multiple SvelteKit apps, like they're all listening to the same DOM and things could start to get a little chaotic. So you need some way of clearly delineating what is responsible for what. But I think these problems are solvable. We need to collect some concrete use cases and design around that, because it's one of these things that is very difficult to talk about in the abstract, but like clearly there is a thing there that we want to make, and we should make it happen.
Cool. Regarding mistakes like not introducing TypeScript early enough or not trusting Vite enough from the beginning, can Rich see maybe sometime in the future building for Node.js is a mistake instead of building for Dino?
So again, like a lot of these mistakes were kind of failures to predict the way that things were going. And there were a lot of people who at the beginning of SvelteKit's journey would have said that Dino is going to replace Node. And it certainly has like a very bright trajectory, but I think that some of the initial optimism was a little too enthusiastic. Node clearly isn't going anywhere, but Dino now supports a lot of Node built-ins. It has this Node compatibility layer. It works with NPM. And so I believe that you can, in fact, run Vite on Dino, and by extension, you can run SvelteKit on Dino. So, at the beginning, it just wasn't possible because Vite ran on Node. It uses the file system extensively. SvelteKit also uses the file system extensively. And so it wasn't really realistic. Whether or not we could class that as a mistake now, I don't know. I mean, Node is not bad. Node is still really good. In fact, it's getting much better, largely because of the competition from things like Dino. So I don't feel like there's any great urgency to ditch Node, but it would be nice if running it on Dino and even Bun felt a little bit more natural and native. But so much of that is down to Vite and not us that I don't know. I want to punt on that question for at least a few more months.
I think the next one is building the Svelte compiler for Svelte 4 in Zig. I want someone to mention that in a talk in the future and hold me to it or something. Yeah, no. Okay, any more questions? Cool.
Awesome. Thanks so much for your time, Rich.
All right, thank
I
you.
will take them away. No, thank you, Rich. It was great having you. And I think everyone else really enjoyed the talk. So Anthony and I were both just fillers waiting for you to start up. So we do thank you very much. And thank you to everyone on the stream who's been asking very insightful questions for Rich to answer. And thank you to everyone here. I'm sorry I can't pan the camera or anything, but everyone, if you give Rich a big round of applause to say thank you.
Thank you for having me. This was fun.
And with that, I'm going to have to scurry back on over to the machine and end the stream. But thank you very much, Rich, and thank you everyone here as well.
All right. Stream ended.